Okay, so these are the economic concepts, toss-ups from the You Gotta Know from NAQT. I think there are 28 of them, and many of the concepts, if not all, are asked about more than once. So let's go ahead and get started. Toss-up number one. In the Fisher effect, one form of this quantity remains constant even when the price level increases. One form of this quantity constitutes the y-axis of the ISLM model, and another form constitutes that of a macroeconomic money market. The real form of this quantity equals the nominal one minus the expected rate of inflation. When policies targeting these are ineffective, a liquidity trap occurs. The APR is a yearly form of this quantity, and dividing 72 by this quantity can estimate how many years it takes for an investment to double. For 10 points, name this quantity, which can be simple or compounding and is defined as the price of borrowing money. And that is the interest rate. Toss-up number two. One section of this work describes how the working poor have a mental torpor that make them incapable of rational conversation, tender sentiment, or just judgment. The third section of this work describes the state of agriculture in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, shortly after explaining the natural progress of opulence. Its fourth section describes the motivations behind establishing colonies, and its opening discussion of the division of labor uses the example of a pen factory. This work presents arguments against mercantilism and introduces the concept of the invisible hand. For 10 points, name this work by Adam Smith. And that is The Wealth of Nations. Toss-up 3. According to the Lockean proviso, this specific resource should only be consumed such that enough is left for others. Henry George advocated for a single economy-wide tax on this resource. That tax is levied upon its unimproved form. Eleanor Ostrom asserted that successful communal management of this resource was possible without government, in contrast to Garrett original conclusion in The Tragedy of the Commons. The physiocrats believe that this resource products are the sole source of wealth. This term now denotes all exhaustible natural resources that can be combined with capital and labor to produce goods. For 10 points, name this factor of production that is bought and sold along with the property sitting on top of it in the real estate market. And that is land. Toss-up number 4. A fundamental disagreement between Keynesian and monetarist in economics is the question of what this value is for the LM curve. For Keynesians, it is very high, but for monetarists, it is nearly zero. The arc kind of this quantity eliminates biases caused by the choice of the start point in the traditional formula for the cross kind of it, which measures the relationship between one's goods price and demand for the second good. Goods which cannot live without have value for this quantity. For 10 points, I identify this economic quantity that measures how much some curve, such as demand, can change in response to various conditions. And that is elasticity. Toss-up number 5. Arnold Harberger estimated this condition cost the United States $59 million annually during the 1920s. Gordon Tullock and Ann Kruger found that the social cost of rent-seeking, as exemplified by agents investing towards this condition, greatly exceeds a more famous quantity associated with it. Market failure or high externalities can create a social preference for this condition, a fact suggested by its graphical representation, which depicts consumer surplus adjacent to the famous triangle of deadweight loss. Economies of scale may create the high barriers to entry in this situation, in which the producer is not a price taker. For 10 points, I identify this condition contrasted with perfect competition, in which a market is dominated by a single producer. And that is a monopoly. Toss-up number 6. For durable goods, the long-run price elasticity of this quantity's secondary form is smaller compared to its short-run elasticity, which is always positive. When this quantity's curve shifts to the right, the market clearing price drops. When input costs drop, a rightward shift is seen in this quantity's upward-sloping curve. For 10 points, name this economic concept describing the amount of a good available in a market, often contrasted with demand. And that is supply. Toss-up 7. Robert Putnam talked about the decline of the social type of this resource in Bowling Alone. This concept names a work which introduced the idea of commodity fetishism along with land and labor. It is one of the factors of production in classical economics. Startup firms can benefit from the venture form of this. For 10 points, name this concept that gives its name to an economic system where goods are privately produced and owned. The title subject of a 4-volume work by Frederick Engels and Karl Marx. That is capital. Toss-up number 8. Hauser's law states that federal tax revenues stay around a constant percentage of this value. A 3% rise of this value will cause 1% fall in unemployment, according to Oken's law. This quantity's namesake deflator is calculated by dividing the nominal value of this quantity by its real value. For a European country to join the Eurozone, its national debt must be less than 60% of this value. This value can be found by adding up either a country's expenditures or its total population's income. A percentage change in this value is used to measure economic growth. For 10 points, name this market value of all final goods and services produced within a country. And that is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. Toss-up 9. In a 1987 paper, Olivier Blanchard explained hysteresis in this economic concept. Once it is high, it tends to remain high. Oken's law states that when this goes up, a country's potential GDP is reduced, and it is used in Oken's misery index calculation. The frictional type results from a person trying to improve a current situation, while the structural type is a mismatch between the skills offered and sought. The 2017 U.S. level was less than 5%. For 10 points, give this situation in which workers would like jobs but do not have them. And that is unemployment. Toss-up number 10. Due to its chaotic nature, one of these acts was nicknamed the mongrel by one of its critics. Woodrow Wilson became the first president since John Adams to go before Congress to encourage the passage of one of these acts, sponsored by Oscar Underwood, which reduced the rates of the Payne-Aldrich one. The Great Depression may have been worsened after the passage of one of these acts, named for Hawley and Smoot. These business-protecting acts were reduced between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. upon signing of NAFTA. For 10 points, name these taxes on imported goods. That is tariffs. Toss-up 11. The Leontief paradox refers to the fact that the United States exports goods associated with high level of this, and Marx distinguished the concrete form of this concept from the abstract form, which he used as a universal measure of value. Adam Smith advanced a theory of value named for it in The Wealth of Nations, and Durkheim wrote about the division of it in society. Along with land and capital, it is a major factor of production, and its cost is called wage. For 10 points, give the name for work done by human capital, which employees sell to employers. And that is labor. Toss-up number 12. This function equals the square root of half of the income times the cost of withdrawal, all divided by the interest rate, as shown in the Baumol-Tobin model. The Markovian variety of this quantity is typically used to model inventory control, and the uncompensated and compensated variety of this quantity, Marshallian and Hicksian respectively, are related by the Slutsky equation. Giffen goods violate the namesake law of this quantity, and the graph of this quantity typically has a negative slope, meaning that it decreases as price levels increase. For 10 points, name this economic quantity, usually contrasted with supply. And that is demand. Toss-up number 13. Robert Gordon's triangle model for this phenomenon was based on an earlier Keynesian model, which relates this phenomenon to unemployment. This phenomenon is represented by pi in an equation which states that this phenomenon changes the real interest rate to the nominal interest rate. That equation is the Fisher equation. The wholesale price index measures the rate of this phenomenon before goods hit the market, at which point the consumer price index may be used. This phenomenon comes in built-in, cost push, and demand pull varieties. For 10 points, give this phenomenon the increase of prices over time. That is inflation. Toss-up 14. Paul Samuelson illustrated this concept with a man who is both the best attorney and secretary in Chicago. First introduced in an essay by Robert Torrens, this concept is modeled by the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Another economist explained this concept on Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which use the example of trade between British cloth and Portuguese wine. For 10 points, name this theory developed by David Ricardo, which states that countries should export goods that have the lowest opportunity costs, unlike absolute advantage. And that is comparative advantage. Toss-up 15. When the income effect eventually overwhelms the substitution effect, the supply curve of this specific quantity bends backwards. In perfectly competitive markets, the price of this quantity equals this quantity's marginal product. Karl Marx proposed that the value of a good is dependent on the amount of this quantity that went into its production. Problems in the branch of economics named for this quantity concern the agent's trade-off between leisure and this activity. During the Clinton administration, Robert Reich oversaw the department devoted to this branch of economics. Like capital and land, this quantity is one of the three primary factors of production. For 10 points, name this quantity whose division is described in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And that is, again, labor. Toss-up 16. Mortensen used search and matching theory to model one form of this phenomenon, while external expectations create multiple equilibrium points for it, according to Peter Diamond's coconut model. The Shapiro-Stiglitz model implies that efficiency wages sustain this phenomenon, which is similarly maintained according to the Nauru model developed by Phelps and Friedman. Okun's law posits the inverse relationship between this and GDP, while the Beveridge curve is particularly useful in modeling a type of this phenomenon created by mismatched conditions, its frictional form. The Phillips curve plots inflation against, for 10 points, what economic phenomenon in which laborers are out of work? And that is unemployment. Toss-up 17. This work's last section of the revenue of the sovereign or commonwealth discusses taxation and explains why debts from wars are unlikely to be paid off. Book 4 of this work, Of Systems of Political Economy, attacks mercantilism and specifically protectionist tariffs. Its first section compares agricultural societies to industrial ones and studies pen manufacturing to illustrate ways in which the division of labor can increase industrial productivity. This book uses the concept of an invisible hand to explain individuals acting in their own self-interests. For 10 points, name the 1776 work advocating laissez-faire economics, written by Adam Smith. And that is The Wealth of Nations. Toss-up 18. Some economists claim that this concept is obsolete because factors of production can be relocated. This theory was popularized by the author of Political Economy and Taxation, and it states that trade partners should specialize in processes for which they have lower opportunity costs. David Ricardo uses an example involving Portuguese wine and English cloth to demonstrate this concept. For 10 points, name this concept that shows that countries can benefit from trade despite having absolute advantage in production. That is comparative advantage. Toss-up 19. Deriving this function for a Cobb-Douglas utility function sometimes relies on the Lagrange approach. The Slutsky equation relates changes between two types of this function, one that maximizes utility and another that minimizes expenditure. Those two types of this function are the Marshallian and Hicksian, respectively. The cross-price elasticity of this quantity is positive for substitutes and negative for complements. This quantity and price are negatively correlated, and since when price rises, this quantity typically decreases. For 10 points, name this economic concept, which is often paired with supply. And that is demand. Toss-up 20. The exponents in a Cobb-Douglas production function equal the output variety of this kind of dimensionless quantity. Analytically, one is the derivative of y with respect to x times x over y, so that a vertical line represents a perfect manifestation. Complementary goods have a negative cross-price version of, for 10 points, what ratio of percentage changes in two economic variables? That is elasticity. Toss-up number 21. According to one doctrine, sometimes abbreviated RBD, this process can be prevented from occurring by suspending convertibility. Thomas Sargent and Neil Wallace developed the rational expectations theory to explain why people experiencing the effects of this process over long periods of time are able to predict it. And one thinker stated that it is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. According to Keynesian economics, this process can be caused by cost push. An extreme form of this process occurred in the 1990s Zimbabwe and is called its hyperform. For 10 points, name this economic process which refers to an overall increase in prices. And that is inflation. Toss-up 22. A formula to regulate them and minimize their range was proposed at the Tokyo round negotiations and is known as the Swiss formula. This is similar to a method meant to lower them known as the Uruguay round approach. Deadweight loss often occurs in small nations when these are enacted, which typically come in ad valorem and specific types. The moral one was enacted in 1861, while one passed during Herbert Hoover's presidency led to beggar thy neighbor policies that would exacerbate the effects of the Great Depression. For 10 points, identify this government economic policy that includes one named for Payne Aldrich and Smoot-Hawley that tax imported goods. And those are tariffs. Toss-up 23. Danny Quah and Olivier Blanchard found that the effects of disturbances to this function have permanent effects, as opposed to orthogonal disturbances to a related function, whose effects vanish after 5 years. In the short run, this function has a positive slope when prices are sticky, but in the Keynesian limit, this function's slope is 0, and in the long run, its slope is vertical. Surges in energy prices are a common example of shock to this function. Finding the intersection of this function with one that equals the sum of spending and net exports enables determination of the price level and real domestic output. For 10 points, give this supply curve of a national economy, which is paired with the similar AD curve. That is GDP. Toss-up number 24. A book title for this concept argues that inequality arises when income deriving from this concept outstrips long-term economic growth. One component of the Mundell-Fleming model's impossible trinity is the free movement of this concept. A surprise bestseller of 2013 was Thomas Piketty's book on this concept in the 21st century. Gary Becker helped popularize a type of this concept that includes social skills and technical knowledge. That's this concept's human type. This concept, land and labor, are the main factors of production. For 10 points, name this term for assets like money that can be invested to produce more assets. And that is capital. Toss-up number 25. Ragnar Frisch names a measurement of the elasticity of the supply of this commodity. The supply curve for this commodity will bend backwards and have a negative slope for high prices. The marginal revenue product for this determines its demand curve. A now outdated solution to the paradox of value is that the inherent value of an object depends only on the amount of this needed to produce it. That idea is credited to Karl Marx. Along with land and capital, it's one of the factors of production. The intersection of this good supply and demand curves occurs at a price called a wage. For 10 points, name this good demanded by firms and supplied by workers. And that is labor. Toss-up number 26. Okun's law states that every 1% increase in unemployment results in a 2% decrease in this quantity's potential. At full employment, it equals aggregate demand. Its namesake deflator is the ratio of its nominal value to its real value and is a measure of inflation. It can be found using the income formula or the expenditure formula, which states that it equals C plus I plus G plus NX. An indicator of standard of living is this quantity divided by population, its per capita version. For 10 points, name this economic measure of total production within a single country, not to be confused with GNP. And that is gross domestic product. And I think I got the other one wrong, which is number 23. So I'll go back and fix that later. Toss-up number 27. The supply side analog of these markets is rare today, though they used to be common in company towns. One variety of these arises in the sale of goods that are excludable but not rival. Because demand in these markets is not perfectly elastic, these markets produce less of a good than a perfectly competing firm would, thus engendering their namesake excess burden. While they are sometimes forbidden by antitrust law, legal examples include most public utilities as well as the former British East India Company. For 10 points, identify this market that is characterized by a single firm being the only supplier in its industry. And that is a monopoly. Toss-up number 28, the last. The LIBOR is a common international standard for these entities. In the United States, these entities come in forms such as the discount one. When these are too lax, monetary policy becomes ineffective due to a liquidity trap. Their value is inversely related to the level of investment. Consumers often deal with values set in relation to the prime one. For 10 points, identify this economic quantity which denotes the price of borrowing money. And that would be, of course, the interest rate. And so, good luck, keep studying, and in the video I will fix my error on that previous question, which I think was number 23.